At 9:30 a.m. local time on the morning of April 7th, 2026, the silence of British Columbia's Thompson River Valley was broken not by an explosion or a tremor, but by the high-pitched digital scream of a monitoring array. Deep within the hillside of Saskyn Ridge, a community of 3,500 people clinging to the terrace above the river, a network of high-precision fiber optic strain sensors and GNSS receivers detected a sudden, catastrophic acceleration. Within 90 minutes, the ground beneath the bedrock interface had shifted with enough lateral force to bend the heavy-gauge steel of the Canadian Pacific Kansas City and Canadian National Railway tracks by a staggering 15 centimeters. This was not a localized slump. This was a deep-seated, 4-kilometer wide failure of the Earth moving as a single, cohesive mass toward the water. Right now, as you watch this, the primary artery of the Canadian economy is hemorrhaging. The Trans-Canada Highway, the absolute lifeline connecting the Port of Vancouver to the rest of North America, has been severed. The asphalt has buckled into impassable ridges of black rock and grit. The Geological Survey of Canada had been watching this slope for decades, but what scientists saw in the last hour's data changes everything. This is no longer a creeping geological curiosity. This is a real-time structural collapse of a national corridor. By 11 a.m., Highway 1 was closed in both directions between Lytton and Kamloops. Highway 97C was cut. 60 residents were forcibly evacuated as their foundations groaned and shattered under the stress of a rotating land mass. For the 5 million residents of the Lower Mainland, the reality is setting in. The West Coast is now effectively an island, isolated from the terrestrial supply chains of the Canadian interior. What happened at Saskyn Ridge on April 7th was the inevitable climax of a process that has been documented for more than 110 years. It is a slow-motion disaster that has been sliding inch by agonizing inch since the first geological surveys of the early 20th century. Catalogued by Natural Resources Canada as one of the most volatile active landslides in North America, the Saskyn collapse is a textbook example of a known known, a disaster that was predicted, monitored, and persistently under-addressed. This is the paralysis of a nation. As the tracks deformed between the Ashcroft and Spence's Bridge stations, transcontinental freight stopped dead. Thousands of containers filled with critical goods, from grain to electronics, are now stranded on sidings. Truckers who depend on this corridor face detours of 800 kilometers through mountainous terrain that was never designed for this volume of traffic. The federal government has already declared a state of emergency for British Columbia, committing an initial $75 million for emergency repairs, but the optics are grim. The Ministry of Transport arrived by helicopter to find a landscape that looks like it has been churned by a giant. But beneath the buckled roads lies a deeper truth. The Earth doesn't care about our schedules. The ground has moved, and it shows no sign of stopping. The chronology of the Saskyn Ridge reactivation is a chilling blueprint of geophysical inevitability. While the world slept, the sensors were already screaming. At 3:15 a.m. on April 7th, 2026, a series of vibrating wire piezometers, instruments buried 30 meters deep to measure underground water pressure, recorded a vertical spike in the hydraulic head. This was the first physiological sign of a hillside in cardiac arrest. By 6:15 a.m., the Global Navigation Satellite System, GNSS, station SASK-01, located on the upper terrace near the community's water tower, registered a horizontal displacement vector of 4.2 centimeters toward the Thompson River. By 7:22 a.m., the Geological Survey of Canada's regional seismic network picked up a swarm of high-frequency acoustic emissions. These were not earthquakes in the tectonic sense, but the sound of billions of tons of earth tearing itself away from the bedrock. These are microseismic signals of structural failure, the literal snapping of soil fibers. To understand why this specific 4-kilometer front is moving, we have to look at the Saskyn slip surface, a geological trap set 12,000 years ago during the retreat of the Cordilleran ice sheet. According to a landmark 2003 technical report by the British Columbia Geological Survey, the hillside is composed of two fundamentally incompatible layers. At the base lies a thick sequence of glaciolacustrine silts and high-plasticity clays, deposited in a prehistoric glacial lake. These clays are impermeable, slick, and treacherous. Overlying them is a 40-meter thick blanket of porous glaciofluvial sands and gravels. This upper layer is where the town of Saskyn Ridge, its schools, and its infrastructure were built. The geometry is the catalyst. These layers are inclined at a critical 7-degree angle toward the valley floor. Dr. Elena Durant, a senior geohazard scientist at Natural Resources Canada, has described this interface as a preloaded geological slide. The physics are uncompromising. When the porous upper gravels become saturated, the water migrates downward until it hits the impermeable clay. It cannot penetrate the clay, so it pulls at the contact point, creating what engineers call excess pore water pressure. This water acts as a hydraulic jack, lifting the weight of the entire hillside and neutralizing the friction that holds it in place. The shear resistance of the clay drops to near zero. At that moment, the weight of millions of cubic meters of saturated rock and soil becomes a fluid mess. The 2026 reactivation was triggered by Cyclone Amber, a powerful atmospheric river identified by Environment and Climate Change Canada that stalled over the interior of British Columbia for 72 hours. The system dumped 140 millimeters of rain on top of an already rapid snowmelt from the Monashi Mountains. It was the perfect hydrological storm. By 8:45 a.m., the toe of the landslide, the bottommost part of the moving mass, began to daylight at the riverbank. This is the most violent phase. As the upper mass rotates and pushes downward, the lower clay layers are squeezed like toothpaste, erupting into the Thompson River and physically shoving the riverbed upward. By 9:30 a.m., the mechanical force reached the National Infrastructure Corridor. Mark Belanger, a lead structural engineer for the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway, was one of the first on the scene. His report to the Ministry of Transport was blunt. The ground is not just moving, it is rotating. The rail beds have been displaced laterally by 15 centimeters in less than 2 hours. The tension on the fiber optic lines is at 90% capacity. If the movement doesn't decelerate by noon, we aren't just looking at a track repair. We are looking at the total loss of the western rail link. This is the coupled system in its most destructive form, a meteorological event triggering a hydrological surge, which in turn activates a deep-seated geological failure, resulting in the severance of a continental economic artery. The monitoring data shows that the landslide is moving at a rate of 8 millimeters per hour. In the world of geophysics, that is not a crawl, that is a gallop. Every minute the slide continues, the cost to the Canadian GDP scales by millions of dollars. Yet the only thing the scientists can do is watch the digital telemetry and wait for the friction to return. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Saskyn Ridge reactivation, we must look at the dark lineage of Canadian geohazards. In Canada, the Earth does not just move, it remembers. Geologists at the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, are drawing grim parallels between the 2026 Saskyn event and the 1971 Saint-Jean-Vianney disaster in Quebec, where the sensitive Leda clays liquefied, swallowing an entire neighborhood in minutes. But Saskyn is a different beast, a compound rotational slide of a scale rarely seen in the modern era. While the 1903 Frank slide in Alberta remains the deadliest rock avalanche in our history, involving 82 million tons of limestone, the Saskyn Ridge collapse is arguably more dangerous because it is active and hydrated. It is a 12 million cubic meter engine of destruction that refuses to stop. The science of this disaster is a story of system coupling, a term used by Natural Resources Canada to describe how seemingly unrelated environmental factors conspire to trigger a catastrophe. The 2026 collapse didn't start with Cyclone Amber. It started 2 years earlier, during the record-breaking wildfire seasons of 2024. In the hills surrounding the Thompson Valley, thousands of hectares of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine were incinerated. When a forest dies, the hydrogeological breaks are removed. Without the root systems to anchor the soil and the canopy to intercept precipitation, the recharge rate of the subterranean aquifers increased by an estimated 400%. The ground was essentially being force-fed water for 24 months. By the time the 2026 spring melt combined with the atmospheric river of Cyclone Amber, the Saskyn Ridge was no longer a hillside. It was a pressurized vessel of saturated silt. The data streaming into the GSC's Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, BC, reveals a terrifying twist in the landslide's mechanics. Initial models from the 1990s characterized Saskyn as a translational slide, a simple block sliding down a ramp. But the April 7th telemetry shows a retrogressive rotational failure. As the toe of the landslide slumps into the Thompson River, it removes the weight supporting the mid-slope. This causes the failure to migrate backward, up the hill, toward the town center. At 1:15 p.m., a secondary scarp opened up, just 30 meters from the Saskyn Ridge Elementary School. This is the domino effect of Canadian Cordilleran geology. Every meter the bottom moves, the top becomes more unstable. The statistics are staggering. The GSC's landslide susceptibility map of Canada has long flagged the Thompson River corridor as a high-risk zone, but the 2026 movement has exceeded all maximum credible event parameters. We are seeing horizontal velocities of 18 centimeters per hour in certain sectors, speeds that are traditionally associated with imminent total collapse, not chronic creeping. Dr. Robert 2X, a senior geomorphologist who has consulted for the Ministry of Transportation for 3 decades, issued a haunting assessment in a leaked internal memo. We are no longer looking at a manageable geohazard. The 2026 reactivation suggests a fundamental shift in the basal shear plane. The containment designs from 2002, which relied on 30-meter drainage wells, are now technically obsolete because the failure surface has deepened to 45 meters. We are trying to stop a freight train with a fishing net. This is the predictive gap, the space between what our science can monitor and what our infrastructure can survive. The coupled nature of the 2026 event, wildfire-scarred terrain, record snowpack, and the stalling tropical moisture plume, represents a black swan hydrological trigger. Even more concerning is the river dam scenario. If the landslide mass continues its surge into the Thompson River, it could create a natural dam, backing up water toward Kamloops and threatening a catastrophic outburst flood if the dam breaches. This isn't just a landslide anymore. It is a multi-stage regional threat that could redesign the geography of the British Columbia interior within 48 hours. The clock is not just ticking for the railway. It is ticking for every community downstream. For the 3,500 residents of Saskyn Ridge, the disaster is not a data point on a monitor. It is the sound of their lives being torn apart. James Jim McCauley, a 68-year-old retired locomotive engineer who spent 40 years driving the very trucks now being crushed, stood on his porch at 10:15 a.m. as the world began to liquefy. You don't hear a landslide like this, Jim recalls in a recorded interview with Emergency Management BC. You feel it in your teeth. It's a low-frequency grinding, like 1,000 heavy freights all breaking at once. But it never stops. I looked at my driveway and the asphalt was peeling back like a carpet. My neighbor's garden shed didn't fall over. It just started walking toward the river. By 11 a.m., Jim's basement floor, poured 30 years ago on what he thought was solid ground, erupted. The high-pressure glaciolacustrine blue clay, the grease of this disaster, forced its way through the concrete slab in a series of cold gray plumes. This is the squeeze in action. The sheer weight of the 40-meter thick ridge pressing down on the saturated base until the clay has nowhere to go but up. The human cost is mirrored by a staggering national economic hemorrhage. The Port of Vancouver, Canada's largest gateway, handles approximately $300 billion in goods annually. With the Thompson Valley corridor severed, the pulse of the nation has effectively stopped. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has issued an emergency bulletin estimating the daily economic loss at $280 million Canadian dollars. In the prairies, grain elevators in Saskatchewan and Alberta are hitting capacity because the rail cars can't move west. In the Lower Mainland, grocery store shelves are beginning to show gaps as the just-in-time supply chain, which relies on the Trans-Canada Highway, grinds to a halt. The detour, a grueling 12-hour trek through the Crow's Nest Pass on Highway 3, is already choked with thousands of transport trucks, creating a logistical nightmare that stretches from Hope to Castlegar. Inside the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, Dr. Sarah Chen, a lead seismologist with the Geological Survey of Canada, monitors the telemetry with a grim focus. "We aren't just looking at a road closure," she says, gesturing to a screen displaying a 3D interferometric synthetic aperture radar INSAR map. The Saskyn Ridge landslide is currently moving at 12 centimeters per hour. That is fast enough to see with the naked eye if you look at the bridge abutments. We've had to pull our ground teams back because the risk of a secondary rapid release avalanche is too high. If that entire 4-kilometer front lets go at once, it will create a 20-meter displacement wave in the Thompson River. That's a freshwater tsunami that could wipe out every rail bridge downstream. The structural impacts are cascading into the regional utility grid. BC Hydro reports that 500 kilovolt transmission towers have developed a 10-degree lean as their foundations migrate with the upper gravel layers. At 12:45 p.m., the interior coast fiber optic trunk, the primary data link for Western Canada, was severed. Internet speeds across British Columbia plummeted, and emergency dispatchers in the interior were forced to switch to satellite and radio backups as cellular towers lost their backhaul. Public Safety Canada Coordinator Corporal Anjali Sharma described the scene at the Saskyn Ridge evacuation perimeter as controlled chaos. "We have people refusing to leave their homes because the movement is so slow they don't believe it's a threat," Sharma reports. "They see a crack in the road and think it can be patched. They don't realize that the ground they are standing on is a 12-million-ton ship that has already left the dock." The ecological toll is equally severe. The Thompson River is one of Canada's most critical salmon spawning routes. The toe of the landslide is currently discharging massive volumes of fine silt and ancient clays into the water, spiking turbidity levels to 5,000 NTUs. This sediment effectively suffocates the river, coating the gravel beds and destroying the delicate balance required for the upcoming sockeye run. "It's a double tragedy," says Marcus Tate, a local First Nations fisheries technician. "The land is taking the road, but it's also taking the river. We are watching 1,000 years of natural history being buried under a mountain of mud in a single afternoon." By sunset on April 7th, the total damage to infrastructure, roads, rail, power and telecommunications, is projected to exceed 1.2 billion Canadian dollars, and that figure doesn't include the cost of permanent stabilization. The $75 million emergency fund committed by the federal government is a drop in the bucket. The Minister of Transport's helicopter tour revealed a landscape of geological surgery, where the earth has been sliced and shifted with surgical indifference. The A1 corridor, the CPR tracks, and the very foundation of the town are no longer where the maps say they should be. In the cold logic of geophysics, Saskyn Ridge is no longer a place of residence. It is a mass in motion, and until the friction of the basal clay returns, 4 million people in the Lower Mainland remain cut off from the heart of the country. The 2026 Saskyn Ridge collapse is not an isolated tragedy. It is a diagnostic symptom of a national geological crisis. As the immediate emergency of April 7th transitions into a permanent state of geographical alteration, the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, is sounding an alarm that extends far beyond the Thompson Valley. The data collected by the INSAR satellite constellations and ground-based LiDAR scans in the weeks following the event reveals a disturbing trend. The Saskyn effect is accelerating across the entire western Canadian Cordillera. Preliminary models suggest that the reactivation of the Saskyn slip plain has altered the local stress distribution of the surrounding terrain, potentially destabilizing 3 other major dormant landslide complexes within a 50-kilometer radius. This is the nightmare of cascading geohazards, where one failure creates a mechanical chain reaction across a critical infrastructure corridor. The scientific consensus, as outlined in the GSC's 2027 to 2030 strategic risk forecast, is that we have entered an era of geological fatigue. Canada's primary transport arteries, designed and built in the mid-20th century, were predicated on a climatic stability that no longer exists. The 2026 event proved that our threshold for extreme moisture is being breached annually. Across the country, from the clay-rich slopes of the St. Lawrence River in Quebec to the permafrost-dependent mountains of the Yukon and the coastal bluffs of Newfoundland, the Earth is losing its structural integrity. Natural Resources Canada now catalogs over 12,000 high-risk landslide sites, many of which share the same Pliocene clay substrate as Saskyn. The 2026 reactivation was not the 10th time this hill moved. It was the inevitable release of a system that has been charged by 2 decades of record-breaking precipitation and wildfire-denuded slopes. The most uncomfortable reality of the Saskyn disaster is the cost of structural inaction. For 5 years, a scientific committee of engineers from the University of British Columbia and the Ministry of Transportation had warned that the existing containment strategy was insufficient. A comprehensive $27 million stabilization project featuring deep-seated siphon drainage wells up to 45 meters deep was sitting in the final stages of the federal tendering process when the hill finally moved. These wells were designed to bleed the pore water pressure from the basal clay interface, effectively vacuum sealing the gravels to the bedrock. The project was designed, funded, and ready, but it was trapped in the purgatory of environmental impact assessments and jurisdictional disputes. The 2026 movement rendered that $27 million plan obsolete overnight. Now, the estimated cost of reconstructing the corridor and stabilizing the ridge has ballooned to 1.4 billion Canadian dollars. In terms of national economics, the answer is quantifiable and grim. The price of prevention was 2% of the cost of the catastrophe. As we look toward the 2030s, the vulnerability of the Canadian Golden Corridor remains the single greatest threat to our national security. The Port of Vancouver and the Port of Prince Rupert are the lungs of the Canadian economy, but they breathe through a very narrow and fragile throat. When the ground at Saskyn Ridge rotates, the breath of the nation is cut off. The deep-seated mechanics that make this hillside slide, the 7-degree incline, the impermeable blue clay, the saturated gravels, are not variables we can change. We are fighting a war against gravity and fluid dynamics, and right now, physics is winning. The Minister of Transport has admitted that the A1 highway and the rail lines through the Thompson Valley may never be fixed in the traditional sense. They will simply be managed in a state of perpetual repair, a constant battle against a landscape that wants to return to the riverbed. This is the inevitability that scientists and survivors now live with. The ground beneath our feet is a dynamic, living system that operates on a timeline of millions of years, indifferent to our 5-year economic plans or our century-old railway lines. The data is clear. The Saskyn Ridge will move again. Whether it moves in another 50 years or next Tuesday depends entirely on the next atmospheric river and the next degree of warming. For the residents of the Thompson Valley and the logistics managers of the country, the mission has shifted from prevention to survival. The 2026 event was a warning shot across the bow of a nation. If we fail to listen to the digital scream of the sensors, if we continue to place our most vital infrastructure on borrowed ground without the necessary engineering fortifications, the next collapse won't just sever a highway, it will sever our connection to the Pacific. Drop your province or city in the comments below. We need to know where our community is watching from as we monitor this shifting landscape. And if you want to understand the deep-seated mechanisms of Canada's most dangerous geological hazards, the GSC reports and peer-reviewed studies for this analysis are linked in the description. Follow the data. The clock is always ticking.